In this episode, we're going to talk about preserving evidence correctly, because evidence is what turns a confusing security situation into a story you can prove, explain, and learn from. When people hear the word evidence, they often think only about courtrooms or criminal cases, but in cybersecurity, evidence is valuable even when nothing ever goes to law enforcement. Evidence supports internal investigations, helps you verify what actually happened, and allows you to validate that the incident is truly resolved rather than just quiet. Evidence also protects teams from guesswork and blame because it anchors conclusions to observable facts. For beginners, the key mindset shift is that evidence preservation is not an extra task you do after the exciting part. It is a discipline you practice during the response so you do not accidentally destroy the very information you need. It also helps you communicate accurately because you can say what you know, how you know it, and what remains uncertain. By the end of this, you should understand what chain of custody means, why volatility changes how you collect information, and how documentation discipline makes evidence usable rather than messy. A good place to start is clarifying what counts as evidence in a cybersecurity context, because it is broader than people expect. Evidence can include logs from systems and applications, alerts from monitoring tools, network traffic records, authentication records, file metadata, memory artifacts, and even notes from human observations. It can also include things like email headers, ticket records, and system configuration states, because those can show what changed and when. The common thread is that evidence is something that can support a claim about what happened, what was accessed, what was modified, or how an attacker moved. Evidence can be direct, like a record showing a successful login from an unusual location, or it can be indirect, like a timeline that shows a suspicious process started right before a system began behaving oddly. Beginners often focus only on the most obvious artifacts, like a malicious file, but many incidents leave their best trail in logs and behavioral clues rather than in a single dramatic object. Thinking broadly about evidence helps you avoid tunnel vision. It also helps you preserve the right pieces early, before they roll off due to retention limits or get overwritten by normal system activity. Chain of custody is the idea that evidence must be tracked in a way that shows it remained trustworthy from the moment it was collected to the moment it was used. The reason this matters is simple. If someone can claim evidence was altered, swapped, or mishandled, then conclusions based on it become questionable. Chain of custody is often discussed in legal contexts, but the same logic applies internally because teams need to trust the evidence when making decisions. In practical terms, chain of custody means recording who collected the evidence, when it was collected, where it came from, how it was handled, where it was stored, and who accessed it afterward. It also means protecting evidence from accidental changes, like opening a file in a way that updates timestamps or copying data without preserving metadata. For a beginner, the simplest way to understand chain of custody is to imagine a sealed container that must be labeled and tracked every time it changes hands. The label is your documentation, and the container is your secure storage method, and together they keep the story of the evidence intact. Chain of custody also includes integrity, which is the ability to demonstrate that evidence has not changed since collection. In mature practices, teams use integrity checks to confirm that a collected artifact remains identical over time, which supports confidence in analysis and reporting. Even if you are not doing formal legal work, integrity matters because investigations can stretch over days or weeks, and evidence may be referenced by multiple people. Without integrity tracking, subtle errors can creep in, such as analyzing the wrong copy of a file or mixing artifacts from different systems. Beginners sometimes think that simply saving something is enough, but saving without tracking can create confusion about what is original and what is a working copy. A strong habit is to preserve an original, protected copy for reference and create separate working copies for analysis, so analysis work never changes the preserved baseline. That practice aligns with chain of custody because it keeps the evidence stable and creates a clear record of what was used for what purpose. When you can show that stability, your conclusions become easier to defend and easier to trust. Volatility is a concept that changes how you prioritize evidence collection, because some information disappears quickly while other information lasts. Volatile information is data that lives in places like memory, running processes, live network connections, temporary caches, and active sessions, and it can vanish when a system is rebooted, shut down, or even just left running long enough. Less volatile information includes things like stored logs, files on disk, and configuration data, which typically persist longer, though even those can be overwritten or rotated out. The key beginner idea is that you cannot collect everything at once, so you should prioritize what will be lost first. If you shut down a system too quickly, you might stop active harm, but you might also wipe out memory artifacts that would reveal what malware was doing or what connections existed. If you wait too long, those same artifacts might disappear naturally or be overwritten by normal activity. Volatility forces you to balance containment decisions with evidence needs, and that balance depends on the incident type, the risk of ongoing harm, and the organization's priorities. Knowing that volatility exists is what prevents you from making evidence-destroying decisions by accident. A useful mental model for volatility is to think in terms of layers, where the most fragile information is at the top and the most durable is at the bottom. At the top are running states, like what is currently in memory, what processes are active, and what network connections are open. Below that are temporary files and caches that may be cleared quickly. Below that are logs and stored files that might last until rotated or deleted. At the bottom are things like backups and archived records that persist longer, though they may not capture the exact moment of the incident. You do not need to memorize a perfect ordering to benefit from this model. You just need to remember that some evidence is time-sensitive and will vanish if you delay or if you take disruptive actions. This model also explains why responders often collect certain snapshots early in an investigation, even if they plan to isolate or rebuild a system later. It is not because they want to be slow. It is because they want to preserve the most perishable truth. When you understand volatility, you can explain why evidence collection is part of responsible response rather than a distraction. Documentation discipline is what turns evidence into something usable, because evidence without context is just a pile of data. Documentation includes a timeline of key events, notes on who observed what, records of actions taken, and references to where evidence was stored. Beginners often underestimate how hard it is to reconstruct events later if you do not document them as they happen. Under stress, people forget times, confuse sequences, and assume someone else wrote it down, and those gaps become painful later when you try to prove that containment worked or determine whether an action caused a side effect. Documentation also helps coordination, because multiple responders may be working in parallel, and a shared record prevents duplication and conflicting actions. A disciplined approach includes recording the time of each major action, the reason for the action, and the observed outcome afterward. It also includes recording uncertainties, such as what is suspected but not confirmed, so later readers do not mistake hypotheses for facts. Clear documentation is not just administrative. It is a security control because it reduces confusion and supports correct decision-making. Another important aspect of documentation discipline is precision in describing systems, accounts, and artifacts, because vague descriptions create ambiguity that can break the investigation. If you write a note that says the server was isolated, but you do not specify which server, when, and how it was isolated, then the note is not actionable. If you record that a suspicious login occurred, but you do not record what account, what source, what time, and what system accepted it, then you cannot reliably tie it to other evidence. Precision also matters when teams shift work across time, such as handing off to another responder or another shift. In those situations, your documentation becomes the continuity that prevents the investigation from restarting repeatedly. Beginners sometimes worry that documenting slows them down, but the opposite is usually true, because good notes reduce rework and reduce arguments about what happened. Documentation also makes reporting easier, because a final incident summary is essentially a cleaned-up version of the timeline and evidence references you maintained during response. If you document well during the incident, you write the report with less stress afterward. Preserving evidence correctly also requires you to think about access control and confidentiality, because evidence can contain sensitive information. Logs can include usernames, device identifiers, and activity patterns, and collected artifacts can include personal information or confidential business data. This is why evidence storage should be protected and access should be limited to people who truly need it. Beginners sometimes focus only on preserving evidence, and forget that evidence itself can become a new risk if it is mishandled or widely shared. Another key point is to avoid unnecessary duplication, because duplicates increase the chance that a copy will be left somewhere insecure. When you create working copies for analysis, you should treat them with the same respect as the originals, because they may contain the same sensitive content. You should also be mindful of what you include in communications, because sending raw evidence over casual channels can create privacy and compliance problems. A disciplined approach keeps evidence in controlled storage, references it through documented identifiers, and shares only what is needed for decision-making. That approach protects the organization while still enabling effective investigation. When you put chain of custody, volatility, and documentation discipline together, you get a practical approach to evidence preservation that supports both response and learning. Chain of custody keeps evidence trustworthy by tracking handling and access. Volatility shapes your timing and prioritization so you do not lose fragile information. Documentation discipline provides context and continuity, so evidence can be interpreted correctly and used to guide decisions. For beginners, the biggest takeaway is that evidence preservation is not about being perfect. It is about being consistent and intentional. You want to be able to say, with confidence, what you collected, when you collected it, where it came from, and what it shows. That confidence improves incident handling because it reduces guesswork and supports better containment, eradication, and recovery decisions. It also improves lessons learned because you can identify root causes and validate what fixes would actually prevent recurrence. If you develop these habits early, you will be prepared to handle more complex incidents later without losing the thread of what matters most, which is preserving the truth of what happened while protecting the organization from further harm.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.